All right. Hello, everyone. This is Dwight Woods, the Jeet Kune Rebel, and welcome to the I Love Jeet Kune broadcast number 53. And this is the one about Jeet Kune. Is it a fantasy martial art? So as you guys are logging in, do the usual, say where you're logging in from, and hit the like button so that we get the Facebook, what do you call it? I keep forgetting that term, Facebook algorithmic relevance, right? Okay, right. So Jeet Kune is a fantasy martial art. So here's the origin story, as I like to start with a lot of times. I don't know how many of you have heard this discussion of fantasy martial arts. I first came across it during an episode of Joe Rogan's podcast from a couple of years ago. He was talking with this professor guy, Peter Boghossian. And so Boghossian was on the show a second time more recently. And that's how this all kind of came around, back into my mind, right? So at the start of their discussion, Boghossian said that he had been in martial art, all his life, and Rogan says, what did you start in? And then Boghossian makes this joke about how he started in all of the fantasy martial arts. So Rogan says, like which ones? And he says, well, I tried Kempo, I tried Jeet Kune, I tried Taekwondo, I tried Tai Chi. Which I found interesting because he kept using that verb tried, right? Which to me sounds like, well, maybe you didn't do a whole lot of research before you got into martial art, and so you ended up trying this and trying that and trying the next. I don't know. I don't know the guy personally, right? But he went on to say that when he was in New York, he had trained with Ron Van Cleef, and he had trained also with Shihan Hector Santiago. And he says that when he saw Van Cleef get dominated by Royce Gracie in an early UFC event, then that was kind of a watershed moment for him. It was kind of an epiphany for him. And it started him on this whole other path, right? And then he went on to mention that he has trained with Greg Jackson, right, of UFC fame, and he also trained with, I think he does currently train with Matt Thornton out of SBG in Portland, right? What I found interesting was that when he mentioned his time back in the fantasy arts, and maybe he wasn't calling them fantasy arts at that time, he says that he saw Shihan Santiago, he saw Hector Santiago fight for real. And this is a direct quote. He said that Hector Santiago was quite something, right? So that's kind of interesting because he ends up saying, so that was part of his coming up in the martial arts, and that he thought it was real, but it all turned out to be fantasy. So I want you to remember that, what he said about Hector Santiago, because we're going to come back to that in a little bit, all right? So their conversation then went on, and they were talking about Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and how BJJ plus critical thinking and martial art, in general, that a lot of people have distorted ideas about their ability to defend themselves, and then they even have distorted ideas about the world in general. But that Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu specifically, because of its aliveness training, right? And these are kind of direct quotes. Because of its aliveness training, because of its resisting opponent training, that and Boghossian says this is a huge area that nobody is talking about, right? This idea of reality training, I guess, is what he meant. He says that this is a huge thing that nobody's talking about. And he says, we can understand reason and rationality, testing ideas, and not having to take it on faith. And again, those are kind of direct quotes from the podcast. And I'm just thinking, what it is that these guys must be too young to know that all of that had been done before, right? So they were talking about being tapped while training in jiu-jitsu, and that by being tapped out in jiu-jitsu, you learn the art. In the process of learning the art, you get tapped out thousands of times, right? And so BJJ can be considered a corrective mechanism for the delivery of reality in martial art. And I'm just thinking, okay, well, getting tapped in BJJ is the equivalent of getting tagged, right, or getting bopped in sparring in JKD, because it's their version of sparring, so to speak. Now, granted, you don't want to you could probably survive a lot longer in jiu-jitsu sparring by being tapped out than you survive by getting smacked a lot in kickboxing, right? So yes, granted. But I just think that they must be totally unaware, and maybe it's an age thing. They must be totally unaware of Jeet Kune training in the 1970s, in the 1980s, in the 1990s, and even today, where so much was tested and thrown out because it just didn't work. So if you want a historical and a pictorial rendering of this idea of testing and throwing stuff out, look at Absorb What Is Useful. If you go through the pages, where's the camera? If you go through the pages of this book, you will see a whole lot of stuff where, let's call it the karate technique, is analyzed, it's broken down, and then let's call it the Jeet Kune solution is applied to this standard karate technique. So this idea of testing stuff and throwing out only what works is not new. It's been done, right? But then I thought that maybe the problem is perhaps that Jeet Kune has gone through somewhat of a change, somewhat of a, this is not my quote, somewhat of an identity crisis, perhaps, right? So keep that one in mind also, because we're going to come back to that in a minute, right? In any case, that conversation reminded me of another one that I had been turned on to between the aforementioned Matt Thornton and John Frankel. And they talked about having been at the Inasano Academy and not seeing classes that had an emphasis on reality, right? So I want to talk a little bit also about the origins of the fantastical ideas about martial arts, right? So if you're old enough to have watched Kung Fu films back in the 1970s, right, then you'll remember all of the flying through the air stuff that went on, right? I think that's what they call the wuxia stuff, right? But you don't have to be too old, because when Ang Lee did his homage film to is it homage or homage? All right, to the old Chinese Kung Fu stuff, right? So Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, they had a lot of that fantastical material also, flying through the air and balancing on branches and sword fighting and what have you, right? I remember as a kid coming up in the Kung Fu era, we even used to practice specific sequences from the different movies that we watched, right? So you'd have one guy in one animal style doing what we saw Chen Quan Tai doing on screen against some guy in another style, right? And why? Because whether you understand it or not, you're heavily influenced by what you see, right? People don't understand that. And so martial arts choreography is designed to enthrall and entice us. So of course, at some point, if you're honest with yourself, you're going to admit that you have wondered, well, is it really possible to pull off such and such, right? When you see Jackie Chan do something, when you see Matt Damon do something, when you see Jason Statham do something, right? Because it's so masterfully choreographed, you will stop and think for a second, I wonder if that would really work, right? And then if you're like me and you answer questions on Quora, you'd be amazed at the amount of questions I get about, could so-and-so beat so-and-so in real life, if this and what have you, right? And then we know that I think it's Statham trains martial art for real, outside of training for the movies. So then there's even more legitimacy assigned to the fact that that he trains, right? And so if you think that we're not influenced on a regular basis by what we watch, what we see on like TV and what have you, I'll go political. Ask yourself for a second, right, why there's so much modern day consternation about Google and Facebook and Twitter, right? And what it is that they're doing to influence what the world sees and hears, right? Anyhow, going back to the old days, we were told, for example, that there were hidden techniques in the kata and the forms, right? So now there's that quest for the secret knowledge, right? For the hidden knowledge, right? And who among us is not a fan of the secret knowledge, right? Hello, right? So, you ever heard of the dim mak, the death touch, the poison hand, right? Who among us wouldn't love to have that iron palm technique that I could hit a guy tomorrow, right? And kill him in time for like Christmas or New Year's, right? So this element of fantastical martial art, right? And it's not even just in martial art, because in life, people are more apt to believe in some like esoteric numbering system that they could use to win the lottery than to use a more practical approach to building wealth, such as studying and learning a craft or a trade and getting good at it and going out there and building your wealth through hard work. It's much more enticing to try to follow some esoteric numbering system, right? So the idea of fantasizing about stuff is common amongst, we'll call them human beings, right? So I'll just go back to Bogosian for a second, because when he said he saw Santiago fight for real, Hector Santiago, that he was quite something. So if Bogosian, maybe he wasn't involved in critical thinking at that time, but stop and think. If back in the time when Hector Santiago was involved in fantasy martial art, he could fight for real. So critical thinking applied, well, then it's not fantasy martial art. It's realistic self-defense, because the guy could pull it off. And maybe that's all it was. Maybe it's just that Hector Santiago, whatever it is that he had trained in it to the level where it was real for him and he could pull it off. Maybe Bogosian just never got to that level of expertise, right? So this idea that people who trained in martial art back in the old days, right, like before Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, this idea that they couldn't fight it's not realistic at all, right? People have been fighting for eons, right? So, but don't get me wrong. I don't want you to think that this is me bashing Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Good God, no, right? That art has proven itself over and over again to be functional, to be viable as a self-defense method, as a combat sport method, and what have you. So I'd be like some kind of idiot to talk about, oh, Jiu-Jitsu is a waste of time, right? But to make out that Jeet Kune is among those that is not being trained realistically, well, then I'm going to ask you to hold your horses for a second, because it's kind of ridiculous, especially when we have people like Burton Richardson out there. We got people like Eric Paulson and Greg Nelson still showing to this day in 2018 how it's done after the foundation for realistic training was laid back in the 60s and the 70s with the pioneers in the JKD world, like Bruce Lee and Dan Inosanto and other people, right? So, and then also in the combat stuff, right? Eric Paulson, Burt Richardson. If you guys watched any of the, they are episodes 11, 21, and 22 of the Jeet Kune dialogue. So you can go onto the YouTube and find those episodes there, right? So these guys are still putting Jeet Kune on the line and proven that it is not at all a member of this thing called fantasy martial arts, right? Okay, so that was me spouting off on that stuff. I'm going to leave it there. You guys feel free to comment, ask questions. Oh, here's another thing. Suggest topics, right? Suggest topics that you'd like me to cover or take a stab at in the Jeet Kune broadcast, and I'll see what I can do for you. All right, okay, so that's it. Feel free, share, comment, like it, sign up for notifications of when we go on to when we go live here on Facebook. And on when we start going live on the YouTube, right? Subscribe at the YouTube channels for I Love Jeet Kune and for the Jeet Kune Dialogues. Quick Skill Series Volume 1 still available at I Love Jeet Kune. Coming up on Friday, November 30th. Actually, it's kind of apropos because we were talking about martial art in the movies. So my dialogue will be with George Johnston of Hybrid Fight Academy in England somewhere. I'm not sure yet. I haven't done all my research on him. And it should be at our standard time of 3 p.m. Eastern, right? So that's Friday, November 30th with George Johnston. Next episode of the I Love, of the, what do you call that one? The Jeet Kune Dialogues. All right? Okay, so that's it, right? I'll see you guys back here same time next week for another episode of the I Love Jeet Kune broadcast. And that's it. You guys have a good one. Oh, the shirt. So you've seen this one before. Today's a green day. Yeah. All right. Okay. You guys have a good one. Enjoy the rest of your day. Take care.